Yeah, I suppose it's today the case of nearly.
Exactly. Participated in his campaign.
And he published recently an excellent paper on climate policy and macroeconomic policy. And thus today we have two parts in the conference. The first is about climate policy and macroeconomic policy, and the second part it's about budgetary rules, fiscal rules in Europe. Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So I'm very pleased to be with you virtually to discuss these issues. And let me explain the way in which I started approaching the climate issue. For a long time, the transition to decarbonize economy has been regarded as a very sort of long-term process. Something we should be worrying about in terms of the next generation, what we can do for the next generation. And it was absolutely not part of the discussion on the macroeconomic perspective in the short term and even in the medium term. And the indication of that was that all the policy institutions that actually deal with the short term and the medium term, starting with, the European Commission, DG ECFIN, and the IMF or the OECD, etc., or the ministries of finance or the central banks, up until recently, had basically considered that it was not a problem they had to deal with. And so they were, on sort of a longer term perspective, very much centered around the choice of a price of carbon, a path for the price of carbon, this kind of things. And it has changed. It has changed because we realize the urgency of action. And when we're speaking of the urgency of action, we're experiencing a sort of dramatic shortening of the horizon. It's not about the next generation anymore. It's about what happens in 10 years, even in 20 years. So something that's is really becoming part of what's on the horizon. The demonstration was this, the fact that objectives have been tightened and tightened. So we started with the idea that we had to divide emission by 4 by 2050. Well, it was already a tightening of the objective, but then we're speaking of dividing them by, eliminating them in net terms by 2050, and having this minus 55% reduction by 2030, which is really something that has impact now. So the question is, what does it imply? And I would say it's easy to sort of be puzzled because if we look at the longer term horizon, there are many reasons to be much more optimistic, not in terms of climate change, but in terms of the feasibility of climate action than we were even 10 years ago. 10 years ago, people thought it was feasible, but really hard. And technologies were not there. Technologies were costly. So renewables were costly. Batteries were costly. And the view was that we had to get rid of an efficient system and to adopt a less efficient system. But now, increasingly, with some exceptions, obviously, but increasingly the view is that maybe the real efficiency is to transition to a decarbonized economy because of the collapse of the price of renewables. And the reason why we have seen this collapse is evident ex post. The reason is that the day research started and innovation started to devote itself to finding new solutions, zero carbon solutions, progress has been extremely fast. because for many years and decades, we had just accumulated additional innovation on the basis of dirty technologies. So in a way, the use of carbon and coal had become, by its standard, efficient just because of the accumulation of research, of patents, etc., on the same technology, and much, much less on renewable technology. The fact that the shift has started, and the shift accelerated after the Paris Agreement. The merit of the Paris Agreement was to accelerate this shift, has resulted in this collapse of the price of renewables. And the fact that green capitalism is now betting more and more on this no carbon future. So that's very good news. I said there are some exceptions. One exception, well, the important exception, is agriculture, food. We don't know how to produce meat without emissions. So there are some fields in which technology is not the solution to the problem we're facing, but in many fields it is. So that's the good news. But the other side of the medal is that the cost of the transition, because it's faster, it's bound to be much faster, is uncertain. And here there are again, different views. President Biden recently declared at Glasgow, when I talk to the American people about climate change, I tell them it's about jobs. So which is a sort of very optimistic version. We're speaking of new jobs because clearly there are many things to do, all the housing renovations, the new industries that are being created, transport, etc. But first, he talks about new jobs, but he didn't talk about the destruction of some existing jobs, so the reallocation, but also the very fact, perhaps, yes, there are jobs, but that shouldn't hide the fact that it's a shock to our economic system. And it's a shock to our economic system because we are bound to pay for something that we used to have for free. That's the price of carbon. It's to put a price on something we had for free, the emission of carbon, so clean atmosphere. We know by experience that if we put a price on something we used to have for free, this has implications. This is an additional cost of production. And this cost of production is having detrimental effect on the potential, but also is having effect on income, on costs, etc. So that's the situation we're in. So we have this sort of twin view. Now, how to approach that? I think we should be starting with this sort of view of how would you do if we could do things optimally. So you would set a target of being carbon neutral by 2050, and you would gradually invest in new equipment, in renovation, in new technologies, in order to achieve this change. And the pace of this investment has to be optimal in that it leads you to the end result. You can actually benefit from using technologies that are not yet mature. So some of these investments have to be postponed because the cost decline is coming, is yet to come. But at the same time, if you postpone everything, just imagine that you would thought experiment, you would consider, let's accumulate the technologies and let's do the changeover entirely in 2049. Then obviously you would have to scrap, to discard all your capital stock and to replace it with a new one. So this would be a huge shock. So basically the optimal path is somewhere in between. No? You don't want to do everything too early because you want to benefit from technical progress. You don't want to do it too late. So that's again, I think I don't know this exactly how it's done in Belgium. I think I took as a model the way these things are approached in the UK, which I think has a good governance and a good analytical framework for addressing these issues. Now, if you look at the way they approach it, so what they're saying is that this transition requires so optimal in a way, smooth. It requires investment at the start that would increase to up to 2% of GDP, additional investment in 2030. And gradually, the results from its investment are going to show up in terms of lower costs, but gradually. So only in the sort of, in 10 or 20 years. So initially, you have to invest more. And if you have to invest more, you have to consume less. At least if we consider this as a sort of global phenomenon. Obviously, in an open economy, you can invest more, keep your consumption, and reduce your external surplus or increase your external deficit. But that's not something you can do globally. Globally, if we have to all to do that, and the 2% figure is roughly something there's a convergence on. This implies. So this implies less consumption, which has some, welfare implications because 2% less in terms of percent of GDP consumption by 2030. That's about a 3% decline in total consumption. Over a period of 10 years, it's been 0.3 per year. It's not trivial compared to the rate of growth we have for consumption, with slow growing economies, growing like 1%, 1.5%. It takes off, easily a fourth, let's say, of the growth of consumption. So it's not a trivial dimension. So that's one thing. But the problem is that this assumes everything goes very well, everything goes as planned, as a sort of a social planner who decides exactly when and where to do the investment. Now, if you sort of transition to the real world is different. First, we are going to be most probably late in a way in doing what we've got to do. So there's the cost of sort of precipitous change in the policy. Suddenly you have to accelerate, and this has happened already, and this may happen again. And depending on the countries, I mean, in the US, I'm afraid it's going to happen very suddenly because the US postpones and postpones. They don't want, President Biden is strong on words, but the reluctance of the US society to accept a change in the lifestyle is there. So the more you sort of postpone, the more sudden it is, and the more sudden it is, the more capital you have to put aside. So the cost is augmented by the delay. The more you delay, the higher the cost. If I keep the sort of the end goal constant, I assume that we don't have the option to go beyond 2050 and to continue, etc. Obviously, if you have this option, then things can go on. But we know the consequences of this option, and we know the consequences of this option are more and more harmful because the scientists are telling us what they thought would have happened with an increase of temperature by 4 degrees is now likely to happen with an increase in temperature between 1 and 2 degrees or 2 degrees. So the level of risk has increased enormously. So first thing is, this pace. And then there are two other dimensions that I would like to introduce. One is the dimension of friction. Dimension of friction is that in this sort of smooth economy, you assume that a job loss here is replaced by a job gain there. But we know from experience again that in real life it's much more complicated. That relocating jobs, I mean, there's an issue of skills, there is an issue of location, there is an issue of the speed at which those new jobs are being created. So it's not at all a trivial change. Think of all the debate we've had with international trade. International trade has destroyed jobs, and the sort of simple economist view was that it's a gain for society at large, so new jobs are going to be created. But the more we look into what has happened, the more we find that in local communities, the jobs that were destroyed were not replaced, and people stayed where they live, and people live in close to certain industries. So take what we all have an image of, the car industry. The car industry is starting now, has started its changeover. It's going to happen fast because consumers are turning to electric cars fast, and the regulation is that by 2035 there won't be any fossil fuel cars sold on the market. So for manufacturers, that means all the investment has to go to electric cars. I mean, they would stop completely investing, or they have stopped completely investing in fossil fuel cars. So that means that very quickly we're going to see the consequences in terms of the jobs that are being destroyed. And the jobs gained, they're not likely to be in the auto industry, because an electric car is much less labor intensive than a fossil fuel car. I mean, the mechanics is very labor intensive. A battery, and it's basically a completely different object, an electric car. It's a battery and it's the electronics, but you don't have all the moving pieces. And therefore there's a change in the labor intensity. So this reallocation is going to be difficult, and you have all the subcontractors for the production, fabrication of engines, parts, etc. are located sometimes in small towns. So we're going to have the sort of shocks we've seen with trade, with China, with climate. So that's an important dimension, and we have to be realistic about it. And even if those new jobs are going to be created, the retraining will be something that public policies have to take responsibility for, because a mechanical worker is not someone that will be an expert into insulating building or automation, or these are different jobs. So important dimension. The other dimension that I would like to put the emphasis on is the issue of credibility. We have a big problem with the low credibility of climate policies. Why am I saying that? Well, because the gap between pledges and policies is wide. The International Energy Agency has computed what the difference between pledges made in Glasgow or in previous conferences and the policies actually in place. And the pledges are not sufficient. So everybody is looking at the gap between the pledges and what should be done. But you should also be looking at the difference between the pledges and what is actually done. And so there is a huge gap. So which means that it's not credible. You're entering into commitments that are not backed up by sufficiently strong policies. Which means that from the point of view of an investor, what would you do? Governments is telling you, we're moving there. And you're looking at actions and you see that there is some move in this direction, but you don't know at what speed it will go. You don't know the conditions that are going to be created. So basically the risk is that you don't invest in brown, because you feel that brown is over, but you don't invest in green because you don't have enough clarity for a green investment. Meaning that or to put it differently, the cost of capital when you go and borrow for a project is going to be high because there is a risk premium, there is a political risk premium. So that's a danger, and that means ultimately it's going to non-credible policies increase the cost. Simply because the capital cost is higher, because there is a hesitancy on the part of businesses. So you should be moving, but you wait, and that's bad. So I think we have a significant credibility problem. Fortunately, in Europe, we have this EU framework that's a coordination device. So the EU framework will serve us as a way to overcome the difficulty. But I'm coming from a country where we had twice a government backtracking on climate-related measures. The first was the eco tax, that was in 2013. It was on there were porticos installed to levy a tax on trucks going through France. Actually largely non-French trucks, because going, let's say, from Germany to Spain and crossing through the territory, and they would have had to pay for sort of a usage charge. And then there was this uproar in Brittany, and the government backtracked. And the second was everybody knows about it, the yellow vest. So it indicates that it's not enough to sort of have stated intentions or even stated policies. You have to implement them. So this is an additional difficulty. So that's where we are, and the risk would be sort of to make the transition too bumpy, too costly. But I think there is quite a lot we can do to improve the way this transition is managed. And I think the role of the public debate, the role of the social debate with social partners, with government, is really should really be to sort of clarify the path ahead, to be very clear, very lucid about the obstacle, the costs. There's no point in saying it's just going to be quick and easy. No, it's going to be long, it's going to be painful, although, again, I'm optimistic about the long term, and I think we have a much brighter future ahead. But, there are obstacles on the road. And so the first thing is to be clear about the obstacles on the road. And the second thing is to take the obstacles one by one and to see how they can be minimized. So just to focus on the 2 points I have addressed. One is this issue of where jobs are going to be destroyed, where jobs are going to be created, and how to facilitate the relocation. The other one is how to have a framework that gives as much certainty as possible to economic and social actors, so that the investment are taking place, and therefore the transition is not hampered by the lack of credibility. Let me stop here. I don't hear you.
Benoît, ton micro.
Benoît, ton micro.
Thank you very much. I have a question. When we look to the car production, Europe changed the regulation, and the car production is changing very fast. Is it possible to do that with other sectors? Is the solution to enhance the changing in Europe, because it's difficult for government to change?
I think the car, what happens with the car industry is an interesting lesson, also for my profession. Economists have, for long, economists have said, let's do everything through the price of carbon, for the simple reason that the problem comes from carbon emissions. So let's address the problem, let's tackle the problem at the origin first. And second, assuming that if there is a price for carbon, all economic agents will adjust, so the state doesn't have to make choices of technology. It's done by the market. The state just defines the price of carbon. The problem is that there is an issue with credibility, because this implies, telling people what the price of carbon is going to be in 10 years. That's a question what matters. For car manufacturers, the question is not what the price of carbon now, it's what the price of carbon in 10 years. So it's very difficult to sort of tell them what it will be, and to be certain you will be believed. And second, in some cases, it can be much sort of stronger to give a signal through regulation, because the regulation is simple. If you say you're not going to be able to sell a single fossil fuel car by 2035, then manufacturers are used to that, and they start moving very fast. So the question you're asking is, we did that for, it's being done for cars. Can we do that in all sectors? No, because in some sectors, it's not a matter of standards, it's a matter of, computing the relative prices. So if you, obviously you can do that for housing. You can set standards for new housing. You can do that. I mean, transport in general. You can sort certain industries. You can say, okay, for steel, we want to have this share of clean steel, of green steel by this date. But the economy is much more complex, and in many dimensions, you have to ensure that people make the right choices, and so they need also a pricing. You can't get rid completely of the pricing.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe that Renat has a question. Renat?
Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you. I have one question on financement. You said yes, we need more investment, so 2 to 3% per year, and this entails less consumption. To what extent could you imagine that by creating money by new loans through the EIB and then the ECB, who buys EIB loans, that you drive investment, by creating the finance without having inflation? I think you can imagine that there's some margin in creating money for green climate investment without, especially in these times where inflation is low anyway, and we have large amounts of money that are put in the economy. So wouldn't it be a solution partly that by money creation you look for the finance for investment and make it much a little bit less painful? That's my question.
Sorry, would you mind, I'm speaking in general, telling me which organizations you're...
Yes, okay. Sorry, I'm Renat Hansens. I'm an economist at the CSC, the Christian Trade Union in Belgium.
Hmm. Look, I understand. I mean, let's start from what we did with COVID, right? So with COVID, government had to spend, and there was such an urgency that the question was not how we're going to finance it. It was, there needs to be spending fast, and they need to be backed up by the central bank. And this is what was done. The central bank said, okay, do what you have to do. We're going to support you. This doesn't mean we're going to take charge of the corresponding debt. The central bank never said that. It never said we're going to pay with inflation. It said, just do what you have to do. The question of, and the fact that the central bank buys a debt doesn't eliminate the cost. I mean, the cost anyway at present is zero. And the fact that the central bank bought the debt meant that the price remained zero or negative for all euro area countries. Okay? So it was an insurance. But then the central bank bought the debt, so it's a zero bond, and in fact the central bank issued zero yielding reserves that were bought by the bank. So the question is, what happens tomorrow? Tomorrow, if there is no inflation, things stay like that. If there is some inflation, the central bank will react. If it reacts, it's going to raise interest rates on reserves. And that means there will be a cost paid by the central bank. But the shareholder of the central bank, they're the national central bank. As the shareholder of the national central bank, they're the government. So eventually the costs are going to be passed back to government. Okay? Unless the central bank says, okay, I accept inflation, I don't increase the interest rate, and I pay with inflation, which is not what the central bank has said, and which is not without costs, because the inflation is one way to get out of an excessive debt burden. We know that. It's not necessarily the most efficient way. In some cases, government have no choice, or central banks have no choice, and this is what's being done. So you could say, let's do the same with climate, but it's much longer term. So what was done with a sort of a 1 year or 2 years horizon, okay, spend and let's see what happens. It's hard to say that for 10 years or 20 years of investment. By the way, the cost, I said the cost is real. Yes, I mean, if you compute, so basically 2% of GDP additional investment over 10 years, 20 years, you're sort of with 40% of GDP, or something of this sort, let's say 40, 50%. It's significant, but it's not the cost of a war. It's closer to the cost of COVID, it's closer to the cost of the financial crisis. But I think, and it's not a fiscal cost. I mean, part of it is a cost to be borne by private agents. I mean, it means, we invest more, we consume less. That's not fiscal. What's fiscal is the state has to actually invest for infrastructure, for public buildings, for social housing, etc. So there is a fiscal cost. And it has also to support the private sector with subsidies, with transfer to poor households, etc. So there is a fiscal cost, but the whole of it, it's not a fiscal cost. So I'm not sure it's not something affordable. So to answer your question, I think the central bank has indicated that it wants to support the transition, but it has not indicated that it wants to depart from its mandate to support the transition. And I think that would, well, legally, that would be hard because it's in the treaty. The treaty said price stability, and subject to price stability, we are supporting the general policies of the EU. And if you were to announce that, you're putting price stability below after the financing of the transition, this would immediately trigger a reaction. So I wouldn't, I'm not completely excluding your solution, but I wouldn't start with a solution. It's in a way, I said it's not the same as a war. It has some characteristic of a war economy. In a war economy, you do what you have to do, and you're trying to pay afterwards. Okay? That's a bit what we've got to do. We've got to do what we have to do. The emergency is such. We shouldn't ex ante say we're going to pay with inflation. I think we can, as I said, I think both to pay with inflation. But the most important is to do it. Is to
Thank you very much. Is there another question? Yes?
Non, je ne vois pas d'autres questions dans le chat en tout cas, mais il y
Je vois une
a
autre main. Non, c'est du Renan.
François Roux qui voulait parler, donc je ne sais pas si on continue comme ça. Pour moi, il n'y a aucun problème. Monsieur Roux, est-ce que vous pouvez prendre la parole? Est-ce que vous pouvez allumer votre micro ou pas? Normalement,
Oui,
c'est possible,
micro.
mais apparemment, c'est possible.
Juste vous présenter avant, s'il vous plaît.
Oui.
Merci.
Voilà. Bonjour Monsieur Pisani, mon nom est François Roux, je suis Senior Advisor à Egmont. I'm going to speak in English because I think it is easier. My question is this, what do you think of those who think or who argue that the new ETS market for housing and transport, which you find in the Commission's proposal on 5th or 55, should be dropped? Should be dropped because it's socially dangerous, and it should be dropped also because it's not efficient from a decarbonization point of view. And these are also the ones who argued that a social transition fund is the solution that should be put forward. How do you see this debate?
The different dimensions is what you're saying. I mean, the fact that it has social consequences and that it will hurt if the ETS is extended is true. And so it raises a question of what to do in order to limit or offset, or on whom to offset those consequences. But it's a different debate to say it's not efficient and it shouldn't be done out of efficiency concerns. I do think that there are good reasons to believe that, I mean, the ETS market finally works. It's a narrow part, it covers a limited part of total emission. And on top of that, some emissions are given for free. Some emission rights are given for free. So I think there's a case for extending the ETS. The question of how much, what should be the share of the corresponding revenues that should be redistributed, I think is a very important and very legitimate question. And I think the 25% that's mentioned in the Commission proposal is too low. You know, we have to move away from the idea that a carbon tax or a traded permits, and the auctioning of permits, is a revenue that can be used for either for lowering other taxes or for financing spending. That was a very common view a few years ago, this double dividend view. So you're increasing taxes on carbon, you're lowering taxes on labor, so you're sort of a win-win. You know, you're making progress in the emission, and at the same time you're reducing some distortion, and so you're creating more jobs. But I think that's an illusion because it doesn't take into account that the fact that this would have major distributional consequences. So yes, the question of how much you should devote and in which way to offsetting the distribution consequences. I'm saying 25% is too low because even if you want to cover the most vulnerable households, it's not sufficient. I mean, just to give you an order of magnitude, I computed that the French budget for 2019, at the time of the uprising of the Yellow Vest, redistributed exactly 25% of the increase in carbon taxes. So I think it's too low a proportion. Now, do you want to cover 50%? Do you want to cover 100%? Some people say, and I think there is a strong case for it. Let's consider that it has to be given back euro for euro. Okay, so if you want something that's clear and that's credible, that's very clear and credible. You're telling people, okay, I'm not making money. The state is not making money with it, because the suspicion that in fact the true goal of the state is to make money, and it pretends that it's to change behavior, but in fact it's just to raise money, which is not without basis, because you know the budget people, right? in any government, you have budget people, and budget people, they always want to make money. So in fact, what happened to Macron is that he started with a view that a larger part had to be redistributed, but the budget people came and sort of, limited the scope of redistribution. So it's not without a basis. But I think to say everything will be given back has the virtue of being very clear. And then if you give back everything, you can actually, you can't cover everyone, but you can help, because have all the different characteristics. It's not a matter of income, it's also a matter of where you live, how much transport cost you're facing, etc. So it's a much more complicated if you want to offset the consequence. But okay, you can if you're devoting the entire budget to offsetting, you can cover widely. The question is, do you want to do that, or do you want to sort of provide more of a lump sum subsidy to change over? Because if you say I'm sort of putting a tax on carbon and I'm going to sort of pay, offset the consequences, the income consequences for the long term, that's not necessarily the best thing to do. Perhaps the best thing to do is to help people change, to help people, change their house, or change their car, or move to a different place. I mean, there are different ways. But so I think that there's a whole reflection there.
Renat, do you have another question?
Yes, if I have, I want to give the chance to other participants to ask questions, but if nobody is there, I would like to go a little bit further on my first question. So I'm working for a trade union. Could you say, from a social point of view, the other option apart from money creating is raising taxes, because there are anyway large needs for public finance. Sometimes people say only 25%, but if you think for the need for innovation, for houses, for lower incomes, these are very high amounts. So one option is raising taxes, but this is always very painful. We see that, and no government in Europe is making the budgets free for the necessary investment. So raising taxes is always painful, for sure. So from a social point of view, if you want to pay the people with the highest wealth more, creating or take the risk to create some inflation is more social than raising taxes, which is always levied on the middle classes, but with upper classes escaping by the known ways. So for our plead would be still a good idea to plead for some money creation, to say it simple.
What you're saying is extremely pessimistic about democracy. So you're saying a blind instrument is fair, and a very precise instrument is unfair. It's extraordinary what you're saying. I would say in principle, taxes, if you care about fairness, taxes is the right instrument, right? Because you can decide who pays. I mean, you can vote. It's a democratic choice. There's a burden. You have to share the burden, and you can decide how to share the burden. Inflation is completely blind. So you're telling me, I don't know. I mean, if I own equity, I don't care about inflation. I own, real assets. If I own property, I don't care about inflation. I care about inflation if I'm holding bonds. But I care about inflation if my income is not fully indexed. So for social consequences of inflation, they're not that obvious. We forgot a bit about them because, you know, it's long past, but they're not obviously fair.
Yes. I agree, but I'm thinking also from the perspective of feasibility, it's easier anyway to create some hidden tax and yes, take the risk of.
There's a question about debt. There's a legitimate question about debt, you know, and that's a very difficult question to solve because, you know, if you ask yourself, what's fair vis-a-vis the future generations? Is it to finance this transition 100% with taxes, or with, you know, whatever way of paying it with current income? Or is it to pass on part of the burden to the future generations? And how much of this burden should be passed to future generations? I mean, from a strict, you could argue, you know, the current generations, they created the problem. Yes, it's true. But at the same time, by using fossil fuel technologies, they've created, you know, the prosperity we've created. So the future generations, they will inherit both the prosperity and the sort of distorted prosperity we're in. So in pure normative terms, it's not completely obvious, because we should never forget that the whole technical progress and the whole you know, basis for the prosperity. These are the good sides and they're bad sides, and so we sort of bequesting both the good and the bad side. Now, from a political economy standpoint, the question is, you know, how much the current generation is willing to bear, and sort of, you know, if I were to be able to sort of contract with the future generation, I would ask them, you know, how much are you willing to pay for a better climate? And that's obviously a world equation. I mean, it's not a French or Belgium or EU equation. But it's not obvious that they wouldn't say, okay, I'm willing to pay part, but please preserve the climate because of the risk of irreversibility, which is the big change in our perspectives. That we're not discussing on something that, you know, is more or less, but they can be tipping points. And if we go through tipping point, that's a major responsibility vis-a-vis future generations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can speak about fiscal rule now?
Yeah, sure. Okay, just let me take some notes. Yeah, so on the debate on fiscal rules, so I think I'd like to sort of start by being clear about what the debate is about. Because after, I mean, in the COVID crisis, the right thing was done, the suspension of the rules. What's called the general exemption clause of the Stability Pact. So the Stability Pact does not apply. And then there is an agreement that this exemption will end at the end of next year, unless something unforeseen happens. So the question then is, you know, what to do? Should we go back to the old rules, or should we have new rules? I think that's the debate. So it's not a debate about if we need the rules. It's a debate about which rules and whether it's the right time to reform. And it's not a debate between, obviously there are part of it, but it's not fundamentally a debate between hawks and doves. It's not about being strict or not being strict. It's about the adequacy of the rules. I think we need rules in the monetary union because we learn from experience that a sovereign crisis in the monetary union has major implications cross-border. perhaps we mismanaged, and I'm certain we mismanaged the euro crisis. But the problems Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and then, to some degree, Spain, Italy, Cyprus were confronted with, they were EU problems. They were euro area problems. So because they are cross-border holdings, because they are contagion effects, because the market tests the way the euro area functions on the basis of a certain experience with certain countries and draw lessons for other countries. So plenty of evidence of contagion. So I think the question is that we need rules. Which rules do we need? My strong view is that going back to the old rules is not the right answer. Why? Because those rules, they've proved in part counterproductive, and because they would be, in some respect, especially as a debt rule, the gap with reality would be such that the only way to reinstate the old rules would be sort of to change the interpretation in a way that gives much more flexibility within those rules. I think, people say credibility is 60%. Yes, but, we have debts that are twice as high. So what's the point of saying the rule is 60% and then not to implement the rule, because you just cannot force a country to go back to 60% at high speed. This would be a disaster, and everybody agrees it should be a disaster. So some people say, let's pretend, but give, I don't know. I mean, we had the rule of 1/20th of the gap between the actual debt and 60% should be corrected every year. But if you have 60%, that means if you have 120% debt and you take 1/20th of the gap, that's 3% per year. You're not going to correct, and nobody wants those countries to correct it in this way. So the question is, can we actually reform, or are we so desperate about our collective ability to discuss and find good solutions that we pretend we stick to the old rules? Now, if we correct, and that's my view that we should be doing it, I recognize, just as a sort of caveat, I recognize that there are difficulties having to do with the macroeconomic context, which is, everybody wonders, are we facing an inflation phase, or what's the reason for all these price hikes, etc. We also have the Next Generation EU program that's being implemented, so we don't have the experience behind us of what it yields, etc. So there would be some value in waiting, but I think that if we wait, it's clear we have to reinstate the old rules. And so, on the whole, I think it's better to reform. Now, the key question is, if we consider that debt sustainability remains at the core of the problem, how to approach it in a situation where countries differ both as regards the level of debt, potential growth rate, the ability to correct a situation. And I think we have to recognize that member states are different. They're different in their debt level, but they're different also in their growth rate, and they're different in their ability to record primary surpluses. So let's take the growth rate. Debt level is obvious, but let's take the growth rate. Italy's problem, very clearly, is not the lack of fiscal responsibility. It's just that this country has had no growth for 20 years. I computed that if France had had from 1999 to 2019, so 20 years of the euro, if it had had the same primary surpluses, primary balances as Italy, its debt ratio would have been 45% of GDP instead of 100% of GDP. So basically, the difference between France and Italy was not that Italy was sort of irresponsible and France were responsible. On the contrary, it was that Italy had no growth and France had growth. And so the question, and Mario Draghi has understood that very well with his plan. He wants to generate growth. So that's the first thing. You have to factor in this dimension of growth. And the second dimension I want to factor in is the fact that we don't have all the same ability to record primary surpluses. Belgium has been remarkable. Remarkable. You're smiling. Belgium, let's put it this way, has been able to do what other countries haven't been able to do. Sort of have primary surpluses for a long time, after having recorded extremely high debt levels in the early 90s, the 80s. But doesn't happen everywhere. So I think it would be reasonable to sort of set a generic definition and then have differentiated debt targets. And so the question, when you think debt targets have to be differentiated, how would you manage that? And that brings you to the notion that it needs to be more decentralized. That it cannot be the Commission telling Belgium, here's your debt target, and telling Portugal or telling Italy or telling the Netherlands, here's your debt target. It has to sort of start from the country itself. So the proposal I've put forward with colleagues is, let's have countries, governments, setting targets, but then let's check that these targets are prudent enough. And that should be done on the basis of a common methodology by, at the same time, or successively, sorry, the Fiscal Council. I don't know how it's called in Belgium, the Independent Fiscal Council. C'est
le Conseil supérieur des finances.
Conseil supérieur des finances, okay. They would check. So let's say you're setting a debt target of at 5-year horizon. I mean, you can also set a longer term, but at a 5-year horizon, a new government comes in, and the government says, in 5 years, I want my debt to be at that level. And then the Conseil supérieur des finances would say, okay, it's prudent or it's not prudent, and it would, this assessment would go to the Commission, would go to the ECOFIN, and they would approve or reject this debt target. And then once the debt target is approved, it would serve as, with an expenditure rule, to sort of set a path of expenditures that would be stable over the term of the Parliament, and that would be consistent with the debt target. The reason why I'm proposing this, that the experience with structural deficits that were introduced after the reform in 2005 has been disappointing. The structural deficits, I mean, the idea was, I think there were strong reasons for the idea that the observable deficit, the headline deficit, depends on things that are not under the control of the government. So setting targets for the headline deficit is meaning, you're setting a target, but you don't have the means to sort of reach a target. So you would correct for the cycle and get to something that can be actually under the control of the government or in Parliament. The problem, however, that we went through such a difficult times, such a bumpy situation, that nobody knows what this structural deficit actually is, and it's prone to measurement errors, and the degree to which those measurement errors affect the discussion on structural deficit is excessive. So I think we should get rid of it. Perhaps just to finish, there are two issues. So on what I said, I'm sort of, I'm fairly confident, and also I see quite some convergence among economists, at least, on this type of ideas. I'm not saying everybody agrees on each and every detail, but the notion that you have to move to something that's more medium term, more differentiated, that's debt-centered, and that translates into an expenditure rules as a way to sort of organize policy. That's fairly consensual. So the European Fiscal Board did something, proposed something that's consistent. There were also the German Sachverständigenrat and the French Conseil des économiques. They had also ideas that so there is some degree of convergence. What's more difficult, there are two things. One is this, going back to what I said before. What should there be a green exception? And here we sort of very much the start of the discussion. My own view is that, well, first of all, the fact that it's a green debt does not eliminate the fact that it's a debt. So if your debt ratio is too high, it's not by labeling the additional debt green that you're going to, address the situation. So it has to be subject to a sustainability constraint. Now, within this framework, is there a case for a green exemption, which clearly has an enormous political traction? You see what's being cooked in Germany in the negotiation. It's clear that something of this sort will emerge from the negotiation. The Greens want a carve out. The Liberals wants to stick to the rules, but perhaps they could give it as a concession. So I think the conversation is going to really move in this direction. So if we do that, one thing I would be adamant on is don't use an accounting approach. Don't pretend to be able to distinguish in each and every spending or investment, this is green, this is not green, because that would be a nightmare, and there would be and any accounting approach has the downside is that you really don't know what you do economically. So I would be much more in favor of saying, okay, let's consider that a government can set a program of action on non-permanent expenditure with a certain goal, and that these non-permanent expenditure being scrutinized, after having been scrutinized, would be treated differently. So in a way, a bit learning from the NGU approach, that there are programs, a dedicated investment to certain ends with milestones and targets, etc., and that, well, at present is being financed by EU money, but you could say it's going to be financed out of the rule of the stability pact. So it's not my preferred solution, but I think if we go in this direction, I would say let's avoid saying ex ante we define all the conditions for an investment to qualify. The second point is that there is a discussion on how the fiscal policy can help in situations not as acute as the COVID situation, but still situation with the ECB is not able to, with its own instruments, to do what it's supposed to do. I was in a panel with Philippe Lane of the ECB on Thursday last week, and he made a proposal, which is actually on the ECB website, saying when inflation is below target for the ECB, then fiscal policy should be more supportive. When inflation is above target, then consolidation, fiscal consolidation should be faster. So you're setting a goal for fiscal policy, but then you sort of tweak a bit depending on what the situation. So it's a way to organize a policy mix without formal coordination, just by saying that fiscal policy on the margin helps by departing from the strict rules, the expenditure rules I mentioned, depending on the macro situation as assessed by the gap between the ECB target and actual inflation. But I think that's another dimension of the policy debate that's new. Maastricht was designed in a world where fiscal policy and monetary policy were completely different things, and all the obsession was to separate the two as much as possible, and to protect monetary policy from possibly pressures from government. Now we're in a different world in which it's difficult for central banks to do their jobs, with interest rates being so low, and the interest rates are not low because of the central bank. They're low for structural reasons. Because the interest rate is so low, it's difficult for the central bank to rely exclusively or massively on non-conventional tools. So the policy mix is making a comeback, and I think I would say yes, the way the rules should be amended should ideally also take into account this dimension, which means that it cannot remain absolutely simple. I mean, there is also the goal of being simple, but being simple when you have several objectives, and I mentioned 2 additional, it's difficult. You're muted.
Ton micro, Benoît.
Voilà, merci. Thank you very much. Some question now? Renat.
Sorry to always be, but if our
He's an active member.
yes, a week ago or some 10 days ago, we heard Olivier Blanchard on the same topic. Could we conclude that what you're proposing with the member states setting the targets and independent fiscal institutions or financial institutions giving an assessment, and then the Council and the Commission coming in the play, is quite close to what he proposes. He proposes more to have standards instead of strict rules, and so you need a good financial institutions making the assessment. This is my personal conclusion. My question is it correct? It's quite close to his proposal.
Yeah, Olivier is a colleague and a friend, and we discuss quite a lot. So basically, in his paper with Tettelmeyer and Leandro, he sort of went all the way towards redefining entirely the system. And in my paper with Philippe Martin and Xavier Arago, we said that's not realistic. We want to keep the treaty. Let's keep the treaty, and let's try to find what we can do within the treaty. And so the big difference is that we're saying, okay, let's have different rules, and he says, let's get rid of rules and have standards. So standards, he explained what he means by that. Apart from that, there are similarities, and basically what he said is that okay, if you can't get rid of the rules, he would be supporting the type of rules I have proposed. Which, in terms of the diagnosis, I think we're fairly close. In terms of the prescription, yeah, it's different, but it's not miles away. I mean, he also emphasizes that we have to be serious about sustainability, that you can't take the risk of letting a new sovereign crisis happen. So he would do it by this debt sustainability assessment, and not on the basis of rules. We would sort of put more emphasis on rules and use the explicit debt target as something that would be assessed either at sufficient or insufficient, depending on this kind of sustainability assessment. But yes, so, and within that, to give the possibility of playing the stabilization role of fiscal policy as much as possible, and avoiding unnecessary straitjackets. So discipline, I mean, something that's tight on the essential and gives more leeway on the day-to-day management.
Thank you. Another question? But is it possible to find a rule compatible with academic analysis and political choice? Because sustainability for economists, I am an economist, is very clear. But I just finished a report over the sustainability of the debt of Walloon region, and it's very complicated to explain that.
Well, yes, it's complicated to measure, it's complicated to assess. I mean, we're speaking of risk assessment, right?
And thus, is it possible to use that with a political aspect with the European Council?
Well, we have a sort of, in the EU, there is a technocratic apparatus, right? So there is this tradition of going through a very technical discussion in order to provide a basis for political choices. So I would say, yes, what's more difficult is within our societies, within our political systems, how to sort of communicate something that's clear enough and that helps organize the type of debate we need to have, right? So that's more difficult. But we're in a world of, inevitable compromises between analytical clarity and compatibility with treaties, and sort of built in also the legacy of where we're coming from, and the political processes.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Renat?
Yes, thank you. Our accounting rule is on debt is quite simple. All debt is debt. There's no differentiations for member states who have large assets. So my question would be, for sure, for a state having large financial assets, it's very easy to lower debt. So shouldn't be taken account at least of financial assets of a state. and diminish it from the gross debt. But you could go further and say a state, let's take France, who has much invested in infrastructure, so is ready, has an infrastructure that promotes economic growth, is in a better situation than Germany, who has a lower debt, but didn't take the opportunity to invest in roads and infrastructure and the internet, broadband, etc., etc. So shouldn't we have this differentiation when we calculate debt?
Though there are two different questions. The financial assets side is relatively easy because if you're assuming those are liquid assets, they could be taken into account in a sustainability analysis with a sort of provision that in a stress situation, these assets would risk losing value, or if depending on the liquidity, you can also, if there are fire sales, I mean, that's so it's just, you can't just take the market value in normal times and say this is the value of those assets. Unless you're sort of, the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, you have a very large portfolio of financial assets. You're a small economy, so basically there's no liquidity concern. But if your financial assets are domestic, you own, by, for example, state-owned companies or participations in the capital of some companies, then it's becoming more difficult. Also because when you're in a stress, those companies are going to be affected directly or indirectly, so the value of the equity will go down. That's what we saw in Greece. In Greece, there was this idea that the Greek government had assets it could privatize. And when the IMF and the Troika came in, they had extraordinarily ambitious hypothesis for what could be, what the disposal of those assets could yield. And 1 or 2 years later, this sort of completely disappeared because the actual experience was that in a stress situation, those assets lose value. And so you don't necessarily have buyers. I mean, who would have wanted to buy Greek assets at the time? The other question, it's about real assets, so real infrastructure, etc. And it's not the same because it may enter the sustainability assessment if I'm saying I'm investing, I took the example of Italy. Italy is investing in modernizing its infrastructure, which was not in great shape. And so the question is, when you do the assessment, can you factor in the increase in the denominator? Yeah? Because there's more growth down the road. I would say you should do it very cautiously. It's too easy to pretend that every spending is going to yield extraordinary results. So you should do it very conservatively. But and with this provision, yes, because if you don't do that, what you mean is that the Italian strategy would not be allowed, or it has been allowed and has been actually endorsed by the in the context of NGU. So it's not a stability pact context. It has been endorsed by NGU, by the Commission.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Last question. Martel.
Yes, I'm not a specialist, but I'm very interested. I'm not an economist.
Would you present
the opportunity to ask a question because I see that there are not so many. I'm Marta Williams from United Freelancers. It's a section of the CSC union, so the same union as Renat. my question is the following one. You insisted at the beginning on the cost of new infrastructure and the cost of the transformation of the economy into a carbon neutral economy, the cost of replacing all the capital stock. But naturally, this huge cost should also have a carbon cost. I mean, going to change everything in the production process has also a carbon cost. So do you have an idea of the carbon cost of the transformation itself to a carbon neutral economy?
Are you referring to the fact that the production of the new capital itself has a carbon content?
Yes, exactly.
Yes, I mean, you know, you can't do that in principle. You have to go through the analysis of equipment on a item on category by category basis. But yes, you should do that because you're thinking in terms of the, you know, what the impact on emission, and obviously you should also take into account the impact on emission of the capital you're using, the equipment you're using. Now, I say it should be done. I'm not sure it's done. It's always done, but that's part of the more comprehensive approach we need to take.
Okay. So it should be done, but you don't have any prices ID at this moment of what could be the carbon cost. It's because, well,
no.
The purpose is to limit carbon emission. So naturally, the transformation itself will imply carbon emission. So, well, voilà, I'm interested in the process of transformation itself. Naturally, the goal is to go to a carbon neutral production system, but if the carbon cost to go to this new system is huge, okay, this means we need to make a lot more reduction in the current consumption model.
The question you're asking is also if you're importing part of your capital, is it taken into account, is the carbon content of this capital taken into account in the analysis of your perspectives? That's done, you know, by whoever is in charge, and that's an interesting point. I actually do not know, because you know, in the COP system, each country is responsible for what's emitted on its territory. So assume you would buy from a foreign source an equipment that saves you a lot of carbon emissions, but actually whose production has generated carbon emission. I'm not sure it would be taken into account in the sort of standard approaches. Good question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Last question.
There are no more questions.
So thank you very much for your questions for this debate.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation and the time you spent with Economic Council of Belgium. It's very important to the discussion and the vision of the Council today and tomorrow, and to prepare the transition of the economy and the debate over fiscal rule in Belgium, because it's very complicated. The level of the rule in Belgium is not so good. The debt is increasing a lot, and the deficit also. And we have also the problem in the region, and not only in the fiscal, in the federal level. Mm-hmm. Professor, thank you very much. And we sent you the report. After the consultation, we want to write a report with some consideration and maybe some proposition to the Commission. It's the objective of the debate, and we will send to you the conclusion of the Council.
With pleasure.
Thank you very much, and a good day.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.